Hey class, so we're back. This is chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all on stocks and stock valuations. So if you remember from chapter 6, when we were doing bonds and bond valuations, I mentioned to you all that the biggest difference between bonds and stocks is what they represent. And so before you try to tackle any mathematical or quantitative examples from chapter 7, I hope that you've read the first part of the chapter that discusses these things. But to summarize, the biggest thing that you need to understand is that if you think back to your accounting balance sheet equation, you'll remember that everything that is financed at a company, so basically, like if we say all of a company's assets, right, are financed either through debt or through equity. And we say that we call debt in the accounting equation liabilities, right? Or plus owner's equity, right? And so in chapter 6, what you learned how to do was to value a debt instrument, which is a bond. A bond is a debt instrument. This chapter, you're going to learn how to value the stock or the owner's equity, which is the other half of that equation. And so there are some easy examples and there are some hard examples. Why is that? Well, it's because there's a lot more information that goes into valuing a stock than necessarily valuing a bond. And because there's more information that can affect the value of a stock, it forces us to use some different types of valuation depending on what information is being given to us. And this goes back to why I'm going to try to teach you as best as I can how to use buzzwords to kind of tell you what's being asked of you. Okay, so we're going to start off really simple, and then we're going to transition to more and more difficult problems. Some of these are really tricky, and this is one of the only chapters in this class where you are going to have to use a little bit of algebra, nothing too complicated, but there is some algebra that you got to know how to use. Otherwise, you're going to struggle a little bit. But luckily, we're still going to be able to rely very much on our BA2 Plus calculator for the bulk of this chapter. Okay, so again, if you haven't already, you need to stop this video and go back and read, because there are some different vocabulary words that you may not be familiar with just yet. And if you're not familiar with them, you need to get familiar with them before you really start learning how to do valuations. So if you have not read sections 7.1, 7.2 from chapter 7, stop the video, pause it for a second, go back and read them, because if you're not, you're going to be confused. All right, but if you've gotten to at least section 3, then you're prepared to do or to review this video, because this video is going to show you 2 examples. We're going to do example 1 and example 2 from this chapter, and I'll explain along the way what these are examples of. But the big takeaway from this chapter is you're going to learn how to value stock given different types of information. All right, so let's look at this problem. And what I've done here is I've told you kind of like the type of valuation that we're going to do and the information that you might see. So in bold here, this is an example of finding the value of a stock today when dividends are known and the sale price is already known. Okay, so every problem that I do for this chapter, I'm going to give you like a bold title that should help you understand what's being given, but just know that when you do your homework, when you do your quiz, that's not going to be given to you. You're going to have to kind of be able to determine that on your own. All right, so let's read this problem first, and we'll call out some buzzwords. So Agnes wants to purchase common stock. So we know we're working with an equity instrument. She's looking at New Frontier Inc., and she wants to hold it for 3 years. This is very important information, the 3 years. Why? Because that tells us that it is a finite holding period. Finite is a fancy term for we know that there's an end, because this is one of the tricky parts about having stock, right? Is if we look back to the accounting equation, whoops, I don't know what I did there. Sorry about that. So if we look back to the accounting equation here, when there's a debt instrument, we always know that there's an end date, right? There's always a finite holding period, because if the holder of the debt instrument decides to hold it all the way through to maturity, if you remember from chapter 6, we have a term called maturity, right? Then we know that there's some end game, there's some end date. Well, that's not so simple with equity, is it? Because somebody could purchase a share of stock, and they could hold it indefinitely. We don't know. It really depends on what that investor's strategy is, the reasons why they bought the stock in the first place. Is it a part of a portfolio? Are they day trading? We don't know, right? And since we don't know, it's indefinite. And if you remember from I think it was chapter 4, anytime that we value a financial instrument that with an indefinite outcome, that kind of puts us in the realm of a perpetuity. Whereas a debt instrument, you can kind of say, is more similar to an annuity, because there's a finite holding period, or there's an end in place, right? And so this is kind of like where the huge difference between bonds and stocks comes into play. Bonds are more similar to annuities, and stocks are more similar to perpetuities. But there's information that might be told to us in a problem that allows us to value stock as an annuity. It just depends on what's going on. So let's keep moving. I just wanted to stop and talk about why it's important that we were given that 3-year holding period. Okay, so the directors of the company just announced that they expect to pay an annual cash dividend. All right, so an annual cash dividend of $4 per share for the next 5 years. All right. Agnes believes that she will be able to sell the stock. So we know that she's going to hold it for 3 years, and then she's going to sell the stock for $40 at the end of those 3 years. All very important information. All right. So far, so good. These are all buzzwords that I want you to get used to understanding how to use them. And so in the last line here, it says, in order to earn 12% on this investment, how much should Agnes pay for the stock in today's dollars? Okay, so this is a lot of information. And I think for beginner finance students, the best thing that you can do is to start with a timeline. So let's draw a timeline here. And just based on the information that was given to us in the problem, we know that we are looking for the price of the stock today. I'm just going to use P sub 0, price today. So we know that's what we're looking for. We don't know the answer to that question yet. All right. We also know that she's going to hold it for 3 years. Okay. We know that the price that she expects to sell for in year 3 is $40. Okay, so P3 or P sub 3 we know is $40. We also know that the dividends in D sub 1, D sub 2, D sub 3, and I'm actually going to go 2 steps further because we're given the information. So D sub 4 and D sub 5, right? All of these are going to be equal to $4. Okay, so $4. And I'm just going to say, let's see, this gets a little tight here. So I'm just going to say that they're all equal there. Let's see, we'll go green. Money, right? Okay, so on a timeline, The question is how much should I pay for a stock today if the expectation is that I'm going to receive dividends annually? So these are annual dividends over the next 3 years, right? Let's not forget that. So I'm just going to kind of drop these down. So I'm going to get $4 here, 4 here. I'm also going to get 4 here, but I'm going to sell at that same point for $40. So in year 3, I'm actually expecting to get a return of $44 in that year, right? Because I'm selling for $40, but I also should get a dividend in that year, so that's $44. Okay, so maybe some of you are starting to realize how I'm going to use this information. If you haven't quite realized it yet, that's totally fine. We're going to walk through this together. And as I stated before, we are going to use our calculators to solve this. I'm going to avoid doing the algebraic method because for most students in this class, the algebraic method is only going to get more confusing for you, so I'm going to use just our BA2 Plus for this video. But just remember that in year 3, I have a sell value of $40 and a dividend, and they're combined together. If you were doing the algebraic way, you would want them to stay combined, but using the calculator, we're going to keep them split apart. So let's think about this, though. In Chapter 4, you were taught how to value an annuity, if you remember. So in Chapter 4, you were taught how to value annuities. All right. In Chapter 3, you were also taught how to find the present value of any future value, right? And in Chapter 6, you were taught how to value a bond. And when we look at what the cash flows that are going on here, you could basically solve this problem 2 different ways. You can either solve it using what you were taught in Chapters 3 and 4. You could do them separately. So I could find the present value of an annuity, because my dividend stream is simply an annuity stream, is it not? And then I could find the present value of the future sell value of the stock, which is the $40 sell. And then once I have those 2 present values, I could essentially add them together, and that would be the present value that I would expect to pay today. So that's one method, right? I could find the present value of an annuity, and I could add that to the present value of the future value of the stock, so the present value of P3, right? Present value of P3, and then that would equal the present value of the stock today. That would be like equal P0. So that's one method. Or I could look at this and say, well, hey, this is kind of like the same thing as valuing a bond, because with a bond, I know that I get coupon payments, right? And if it's a bond that pays annual coupons with a maturity or face value at the end, that's kind of the same as the information that I'm being given here, right? So I could use this method here, and I could just say, well, that's really similar to having coupons of $4 a year for the next 3 years with a face value of $40 that I'm going to receive at the end. And that's the method that I'm going to use, but just know that you have to have all of the information that you were given in this example. You have to have all of it to be able to value a stock the same way that we value a bond. And then, of course, in future examples, I'll tell you when you can't use this method. But for this particular example, that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to whip out my BA2 Plus. All right. And as always, we're going to go through our time value of money variables, because just like every other problem that we've worked so far, if I can determine 4 of those 5 variables, I can always solve for the 5th one. And so if you remember from Chapter 6, we always immediately assign the variables that we were already given. So we've already been told that in year 3, the face value or the future value the expected sell value of our stock is going to be $40, right? And we already know that we're looking for the present value because we want to know what the price that we would be willing to pay today. So that's the variable that is missing. So just by knowing those two pieces of information, I know that I have to figure out these other three before I can solve the problem. All right. So let's see. What's the next thing? Well, we know that the dividends are received annually, and so we're dealing with annual compounding, right? And so we receive a $4 dividend, right, each year, and it's going to be for how many? Let's see. Is it 4 years or is it 3 years? Well, this is where it gets a little tricky. Let's see here. So she says that she's going to hold it, let's see, at the end of 3 years. At the end of 3 years. So if she's buying it today, 1, 2, 3. Yep, so she's going to hold it for 3 years. Okay. And let's see, the interest rate that she requires on her investment is 12%. So we're going to put a 12 there. And now look at there. We have 4 out of our 5 variables. So this gets really simple at this point, doesn't it? We just plug them in. So 3 for N, 12 for IY, 4 for our payments, right? And then 40 would be the future value that we expect, all right? And then we hit compute present value. And what we find is that if Agnes were to try to buy this stock today with the information that she has been given and with the expected return of 12% per year on her investment, then she should pay no more than $38. And if we go ahead and round to the nearest penny, 8 cents. All right. So that is the first example of how to value a stock. Of course, it should have been really simple because you already really learned how to do this with bonds. And like I said, we start off really easy just to kind of get you more familiar with the vocabulary of working with stocks, but it is going to get harder as we move forward. So let's jump to the next example because I'm going to try to do 2 examples on this one video. So let's go to stock valuations example 2. Okay, so in this example, we are going to look at a situation where we are given information that tells us that we're going to receive quarterly dividends forever. And remember, we talked about this in the last example. So this is really going to change things. And the reason why it's going to change things is because it is a situation where our holdings are indefinite. Okay, so let's say that the Peak Growth Company is paying a quarterly dividend. So Peak Growth Company is paying a quarterly dividend of 50 cents and has decided to pay the same amount forever. If Joe wants to earn an annual rate of return of 12% on his investment, how much should he offer to buy the stock at today? Now, there's a lot of information given to you in this example, but there's also a lot of information that is not given to you. And that's what you have to really be able to key in on here. So first, we have a company. I'm just going to go ahead and draw a timeline. Okay. We have a company that, oops, change to eraser. There we go. So if I go years, 1, 2, 3, ... and I'm just going to say infinity. That's a terrible infinity symbol. Oh, Lord. Let's try that again. There we go. So to infinity and beyond, right? And let's say that they are issuing quarterly dividends. So if they're quarters, first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, first, second, third, first, second, third. Of course, the fourth is the year. So they're getting quarterly dividends of 50 cents. They're 50 cents, 50 cents, so on and so forth, right? And it says that they've decided to pay the same amount forever. So as far as we know, if we were to buy this stock today, we could expect, approximately $2 in dividends every year forever. All right, so we've been given that information so far. So that means that, dividends equal 50 cents per quarter and this is why I talked about this in the first example, in perpetuity, because there's no end, right? No end. Okay. Then it says Joe expects to earn an annual rate of return of 12%. Well, we already know that if we hear the words annual rate of return, required rate of return, right? That's our interest rate that we expect as an APR. So that is 12%. Okay. And then the last part of the problem says, how much should he offer to buy the stock at today? All right. So what's missing here that we had in our first example? Anybody notice anything? What's missing? How much should he offer? He expects to earn a rate of return. Oh, yeah. It doesn't tell us how long he plans to hold it. Okay, so what does that mean? It means I don't really have a lot of information to go off of, right? And since I don't have a lot of information to go off of, there's not a lot I can do here. If Joe comes to me as his financial advisor and says, well, how much should I pay for it? And it's like, well, Joe, you're telling me that the company's going to issue a quarterly dividend in perpetuity, and if you're not telling me when you're going to sell it, then that means you're holding it in perpetuity. Well, if you remember from Chapter 4, we have, we have an equation that solves for the present value of a perpetuity. Does anybody remember? Perpetuity? Anybody remember? It's the payment, or, in that chapter it might have said the cash flow divided by the required rate of return, right? And that's really all we can use here to solve this problem because of the information that is being given to us. And this is why you have to get good at looking at each problem, highlighting those buzzwords, highlighting the information, and then figuring out for yourself what you need to know. Now, you'll notice one other piece of information that I didn't dig into yet, right? The dividend is being issued how often? It's being issued quarterly, right? But Joe's required rate of return is given to you as an annual rate of return. So you might remember from a previous chapter that we have to convert all items that we're working with to the same time frame, right, to get them on an even playing field before we can do any math. And so if our interest rate is given to me as an APR, but my dividends are being given to me as quarterly dividends, then I must convert my I over Y. I must convert it. So I'm going to divide my APR by 4, right? And that's going to be a 3% required rate of return per quarter. Okay? And remember that I over Y is just our calculator button for R, right? So R is 3%, right? And since we're going to do this math algebraically, I also have to convert that to a decimal before I work with it algebraically. All right, and don't forget that the dividends are cash flows that happen every quarter. Those are our payment, right? So we've now gotten all the information that we need to solve this problem. So the present value of a perpetuity, or, this perpetuity that we're evaluating, is going to be equal to a 50-cent dividend divided by a required rate of return of 3%. All right? And so if we just whip out our calculator very quickly, we say 50 cents divided by the required rate of return of 3%. We get $16, and if we go ahead and round, 67 cents. So if you get a stock valuation problem, and all the information that it gives you is that a company is issuing a dividend that is not going to change, that is consistent for the indefinite or foreseeable future, and that an investor is thinking about buying that stock but does not give you any information about how long they plan to hold it. The only information they give you is how much they expect to earn off of it. Then what you need to be hearing is that you have been given a perpetuity problem, and that you must use the formula for a perpetuity to solve that problem. Once the light bulb goes off and you realize that, all you have to do from there is to get all of your terms to be in the same terms. So like in this example, we had to get everything in quarterly terms and then solve for the present value of the perpetuity. Okay, so I think that's enough for one video. I will come back and we're going to do a few more examples, but this is your first exposure to stock valuations. It does get tougher from here. So if you need to take a break, and then come back and watch my next video. All right, thank you.